Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to you, Dr. Quiquivix, who is in California. We are here for the seventh geography webinar that used to be called the Philippine Geographical Society. Wait a minute, I made a mistake. Sorry about that. Redo. We're actually in a geography webinar, and it used to be known as the Brown Bag Colloquium Series. And this is co-sponsored by the Philippine Geographical Journal Lecture Series. And we're here to listen to the discussion today of Dr. Linda Quiquivix, who I went to grad school with in UNC Chapel Hill. But first, let me tell you first about the rules before I call on Dr. Quiquivix. Please keep your microphones on mute to avoid unnecessary background noise during our discussion and session. The lecture is simultaneously streamed at the UP Department of Geography, the YouTube channel. So those of you who doesn't want to be captured by that, you can just turn off your camera. Otherwise, please turn on your camera just for a speaker. The other one is you may send your questions via Zoom or chat box. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can also do the same on YouTube. And we have Professor De Guzman who will be able to get to your questions and bring them here if you're watching it in real time. And finally, the session will be recorded for documentation purposes. So let me introduce to you Dr. Linda Quiquivix, or Kiki as she is known when we went to grad school together. She obtained her PhD under Alpha Gravy in geography at UNC Chapel Hill. The dissertation is on Palestine Mapping, or the political mapping of Palestine, 2012. After that, she went to the critical global humanities at Brown University's Kogat Center as a postdoc. And while we were in grad school, she actually got a certificate for the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. The talk is based on her dissertation research, which produced two articles. And some of you may have a chance to see it in our announcement. The Art of War, Art of Resistance, Palestinian Counter-cartography on Google Earth for the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, which came out in 2014, and the other one, When the Carob Tree Was the Border, on autonomy and Palestinian practices of figuring it out. This came out in 2013 at this publication called Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism. I would also like to acknowledge that this webinar is also sponsored by the Mapping Geo-Narratives Initiative, as well as the Geography 292 class that I'm teaching this semester called Cultures of Mapping and Counter-cartography. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Quiquivix.
Thank you so much, everyone. Can I get a thumbs up to see if you're able to hear me okay and see me okay? Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm going to be sharing some slides with you, a very brief presentation. It'll be about 25 or 30 minutes to talk a little bit about my work with my dissertation research and then what happened after as I had built on. I'm also now writing a book about it for a more popular audience that I'm happy to talk about. And that is more about my personal process in learning about Israel when I was young, and then learning about how Israel was created and being very heartbroken about it when I was older, and how that led me to do this work. But for now, what I'll do is I'll present to you, if that's okay with everyone, a very brief PowerPoint presentation that kind of gives a 101 background on Israel-Palestine, and a little sneak peek into the work that I did, which Dr. Pallas Joseph, great friend, gestured to in those couple of articles that I published. So I'm going to share my screen, and I just want to make sure it looks all right for folks. How is that? Yes, excellent. So most of the time, when you're a student of Israel-Palestine, most conversations begin in the 19th century, whether it's when Napoleon goes to the Middle East, or when Jews start fleeing Europe because of persecution and moving into Palestine. And what I do is a little bit different, and I push history back a little bit more because as I was learning about Palestine, Israel, I started to see a lot of similarities with other processes, colonial processes around the world. So I begin with 1492, but of course we can begin at any moment, and depending on when we begin, we will come up with a different offering, a different lens onto what's happening there. So I begin in 1492, and I think it's really fascinating and of no small consequence that after Columbus's quote unquote discoveries of the Americas in 1492, and he was going on behalf of Spain, immediately Spanish kingdoms and the Portuguese kingdoms start to fight over who's going to get to colonize those areas. And we start to see then the Pope stepping in, because now you have these two countries that are Catholic and they're not supposed to be fighting. And so what the Pope does, and a lot of us learn this, I remember I learned it in high school, but I didn't think it was that important, but now I do. This line that the Pope drew that divided the world into two over anything east of that line, Portugal was allowed to colonize. So here is, this is why part of the Americas, Brazil speaks Portuguese, and so much of Africa was colonized and a lot of Asia as well by the Portuguese. And then anything west of that line was allowed to be colonized by Spain, which is why so much of the Americas speak Spanish. And it was really important because what that did was it inaugurated this idea that the world was now one. There was more knowledge about what the world looked like, and that it could be cut up into a pie or to pieces of objects for ownership at this global scale. And so then what we get for the world is now with modern borders on political geography maps, we get these lines that are these products of these cuts that treat land as objects of property, of external control. So here we have a Middle East and North Africa. I'm just going to zone into where we're going to be talking about today. Here's the Middle East and North Africa, circa 2000s. You start seeing these borders, but what was really fascinating to me is that these borders are so new, and actually they're quite new all over the world. And before these borders existed in this area, we had the Ottoman Empire, which extended out this way, and those borders didn't exist. There was more like the territories that were really important included the sea routes. So the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea, because those were really important trade routes when shipping was very prominent and important at the time. And this is the area I'm highlighting here of where we're going to look in, where Palestine's at. And then we see that Palestine got its borders in 1923, which was right after the end of World War I. The Ottoman Empire had fallen, and so then Europe was deciding who was going to get what, and it decided by making these cuts on maps. And so just as an example of why those territories were going to be so important, Europe at this time in the 19th century was now very powerful, and the Ottoman Empire was falling. And so then this posed a really important question for the European powers: is when the Ottoman territories fall, now that so much of the rest of the world has been colonized by those European powers, and Great Britain was the most powerful, but Germany was eyeing these areas, Russia was eyeing, and so was France, because you had these really two important routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And so what the Eastern question was is, how is it that the power balance or imbalance in Europe is going to change once the Ottoman Empire falls? Who's going to get what? And so as an example of what happens is Napoleon goes to war with Britain, but because he's so afraid of Britain's navy, he turns his warships over to Egypt, Palestine, and that's when we start getting the first modern maps of the area. But what I mean about modern maps is these scientifically measured maps that can be replicable, where they're not sketches, for example, but they're triangulated in a coordinate system. And so then you start getting these maps, largely of Egypt. If you're an anthropologist or if you study anthropology, then you hear about the Encyclopedia of Egypt being very important, and that's where the scientists that Napoleon took start talking about the flora and the fauna and the pyramids and all of that of Egypt. And in the mapping sheets, here you get what this mapping sheet of the Encyclopedia of Egypt looked like, and just putting Palestine on there. It just so happened that Palestine then eventually starts getting a lot of attention, because so much of what was understood as the quote unquote Holy Land for Christians in Europe was now finally opened up again, which it hadn't been accessed since the Crusades. And so immediately you start getting a claim, especially from very conservative evangelical Christians, over this quote unquote Holy Land, and they use science to map out the truth of their specific interpretation of the Bible, which they were interpreting it now as a literal document rather than as an allegorical piece of literature that could really help with moral questions. The Bible was now being read as a very literal historical document. And so from that, they start getting the borders of the promised land according to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And we start getting then the first lines of what Palestine would look like. And it would be from this confluence of religious, imperial, and scientific imperatives that we would get this map, because it was religious scholars that wanted to make this map, but they actually didn't have the tools to make it. They needed to deploy the British Engineering Office, which was the military office, in order to do it. And it was really great for the British because they were able to use religion and science as a cover to go into those territories and map them, because they were still under the Ottoman Empire. And in the 1870s, this map was completed, and a few decades later, it would prove very useful for the British to defeat the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire was then defeated, we start getting claims to those areas. Here is a section of the Ottoman Empire that contains the areas that we now know as like Iraq, Syria, Kuwait. And this is a secret map that was leaked it was made in 1916 by the British and the French and the Russians, about once the Ottoman Empire falls, who's going to get what. And a very interesting story about it is that it was supposed to be a secret map, because on the ground, the British and the French were promising the indigenous inhabitants that they would get autonomy, that they would get their own self-determination. But in secret, what the British and the French were doing was really just using the people on the ground to defeat the Ottomans, and then deciding that they were going to cut up the areas so that they can own it. And that's called the Sykes-Picot map. Russia was part of it, but very soon after, you'd get the Russian Revolution, and the revolutionaries found this map and leaked it to the world about what the Russian Empire had been up to with the British and the French. And this is not at all unique in the world. Just a few decades before, we saw this idea of cutting up the world in Africa. This is the partition of Africa, where that took place in Europe among the European powers, literally laying out a map on a table and deciding which European power was going to get what. And before that, so this is the late 19th century, but even before that, in the 18th century, we already had this logic at play in the Americas, with the carving out of the New World between the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so then you start getting these lines. then going back over then to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we start seeing that Palestine was supposed to be under British, French, and Russian protection. You can see it there in the dark red or orange. And it was at play because there were Palestine has the holy sites that are very important to all three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so it was really difficult to have one country lay claim to it. And so then when you learn about Israel-Palestine, this is usually where it begins at now this point, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. You don't really get the background like how I just gave about the scramble for Africa and its partition, and what preceded that was the partition of the Americas, and then what preceded that was this new global linear thinking that was inaugurated with 1492. So then what you get usually is you begin with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, sometimes, and then, you know, you start, the beginning of politics becomes these borders. So then what happens is that the idea that borders should exist, and that's the way that society should organize politically, just becomes a given, as if it's an ahistorical thing, as if borders have always been around with us forever. The idea of the nation state has been with us forever. That usually doesn't go critiqued among either Palestinians or Israelis. And so here we have the British mandates borders, and the British took over Palestine, calling it a mandate because the word colonialism was now really going out of style. So they didn't want to use that word, a British colony. So they called it a mandate, but it was the same thing. It was the idea that the local population was not mature enough or sophisticated enough to govern themselves. So Britain would take them under their wing, and when Britain decided that they were ready to have their own country, then they would have their own country. You get also then in Europe at this time, and especially when this idea of the nation state starts to arise in the previous century, in the 19th century, you get a massive problem within Europe, and they start talking about like, well, we're going to make France, we're going to make Germany, we're going to make Italy, but what does it mean to be French? You know, so you have this problem of the idea now that there's no longer a monarchy and the people are going to rule, there's a problem over the definition of, well, what do we mean by the people? And so then there's this drive to create a more homogenous type of people that live within that container inside those borders of the new nation state. And so then being different from that idea of what the nation is, put a lot of people at risk for persecution, and Jews faced a lot of that. And so there was a lot of anti-Semitism taking place in Europe. And so there was a lot of debate among Jews in Europe over how they were going to respond. Many decided to assimilate and create Reform Judaism that was, you know, they weren't going to look different. They weren't really going to act different. They're going to be more liberal, to change with the times. Others moved more toward orthodoxy and wanted to insist on their difference. And others wanted to have a more international kind of movements with labor all over the world, not just the Jewish struggle, but an international worker struggle. And then others thought about this idea of creating a nation state for Jews, which is the idea of Zionism. Where Jews could be the majority in a place where they hadn't been able to be before. And so then they decided that they would settle, the Zionist movement decided that it would be in Palestine. And so after, it doesn't really get a lot of traction. It gets some traction, but it gets more traction after World War II and the tragedy of the Holocaust, where now the world was able to see these horrors. And so then the United Nations, which had just been recently created, decided that they were going to split Palestine, cut Palestine into three pieces. The yellow would be for the native population, the Arab state. The orange would be for the new Jewish state. And then the purple area is where Jerusalem and Bethlehem are, would be a more international zone. And what this meant for the native population, the Palestinians, is that anybody who would land or who the border would land on top of them and they were in the Jewish state area would then have to leave and then move over to the Arab areas, which happened a lot, like with population transfer between India and Pakistan. So this was like the logic of the time. And of course, the native population completely refused, and neighboring countries, the new countries of Jordan and Egypt and Syria went to war on behalf of the native population of Palestine against Israel. But the new state of Israel was being armed by the West, and so Israel was victorious. And what ended up happening after the war is that a state of Israel was created, but a state of Palestine was not. And what happened is that in those areas where the state of Israel was created, about 700,000 to 800,000, even more Palestinians they fled, and Israel never allowed them to come back. And so they moved into refugee camps in what becomes the area known as the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. And they've been in refugee camps ever since. Even to this day, they're still there. But this isn't the last war. There was another war that took place almost 2 decades later, and it was the Six-Day War, and Israel was victorious one more time, and it took more land. It took the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights from Syria, and immediately began to settle those areas with more Jews. And the idea was always to try to get more Jews to live there and to just create facts on the ground where now you would have an ordinary everyday life, Jews living there, creating their lives, and to make it difficult for anyone to remove them from those new settlements. Eventually, you get Israel isolating the Palestinians more and more from their neighbors, and the Camp David Treaty, which returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for Egypt to make itself neutral, or at least neutral, or for Israel in this war, made it so that Egypt was no longer going to fight on the side of the Palestinian movement, and it would get the Sinai Peninsula back. And also the United States would give Egypt, the Egyptian government, a lot of money to maintain the peace. Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights would remain occupied, and they're still occupied to this day. In the 1990s, you get the peace process. You have an uprising in 1987 in the West Bank and Gaza, and that makes Israel have a massive PR crisis on its hand, because the world starts to see that Israel isn't really a victim. It's got these massive tanks, a lot of military weapons, and it's going up against a defenseless population that's just only has stones to throw at tanks. And so then the idea, Israel then decides to engage in a peace process and recognize that Palestinians exist, that Israel was created by trying to empty Israel out of non-Jews. And so then the idea with the peace process was to create two states, an Israel and then a Palestine. And Palestine was supposed to be a state with the West Bank and Gaza with some kind of corridor in between. And there was a lot of euphoria about it, even though it was extremely controversial from the perspective of the refugees, because all of the refugees who had lived in what is now Israel, what had been Palestine, continued to insist that they were going to go back to their villages, and they had international law that said that they would, but Israel has just never allowed it. And so usually, like when you get into studying Israel-Palestine, what you see is a series of maps like this, where Palestine is shrinking and Israel continues expanding. And the peace process has been pretty much dead in the water for a really, really long time, because even though the Palestinian leadership agreed to a two-state solution where they would have Gaza and the West Bank, which was a very small part of all of Palestine, Israel still has not declared where its actual borders are. It's one of the only countries in the world that has not declared its official borders. And it continues building Jewish settlements in areas of the West Bank and also the Golan Heights, which makes it then really difficult, if not impossible, to even conceive of what a Palestine state would look like if it's going to be contiguous the way that other nation states are, because it's just a bunch of like cantons now, like these small bits of pieces, especially in the West Bank, where there's just settlements that are just surrounding Palestinian villages. So a framework that I bring into this is the idea that this is a logic that is actually not unique, even if it has its specificities in Israel-Palestine. It's not unique, and it comes from a logic. And here I have a diagram. And the world of 1492, it created that line, the idea of lines where you could cut up the world into objects for ownership. But only Europeans were allowed to cut the world up in that way, because what the greater cut that was made with the creation of the modern world, the world that we live in now, with that logic that has been imposed on the globe, is the idea that there is a non-Europe and there is a Europe. And that division was important because Europe was creating itself as well. And there was a lot of fighting within Europe, and Europe wanted to create a peaceful existence for itself. And it did that how? It did that by exporting out any like lawlessness over to non-Europe and creating like international law and gentlemen's agreements, laws of war within Europe. So Europe was supposed to be the space of peace, where even if there was war, at least there was laws of war. There was supposed to be like a civilized manner in the way that people reacted. And in non-Europe, people, you can go do pirates, you can go be a pirate over there, you can go steal everybody's stuff, you can go kill, and it didn't matter because international law didn't apply there. But then, and this lasted for several centuries until you get, in particular, the creation of the League of Nations and the United Nations, which comes from resistance in the colonies against colonialism. You get the world of universal human equality, but now you have this problem of who is a human, and Europe has a really hard time respecting difference and needs to, and because there's so much at stake, if you're going to give the idea of the human that much power in the world, then for Europeans, they're like, well, we need to figure out what do we mean by the human, and that continued to be the more European, the white, the Christian, the heteronormative kind of being, and then anyone against that project was considered non-human. So this is where the terrorist comes in. And a lot of what has happened with anti-colonial movements a lot of the time is that a lot of colonized people, we have bought into this idea that, when we're told that we're not human, we buy into the idea that there is this human that we need to aspire to. So then we try to get the oppressor to recognize us as human. And so then this is a lot of assimilationist moves. And that's why I have those yellow arrows where we try to assimilate in. But what ends up happening with that is that we end up just replicating this, because then we have to differentiate ourselves between others. So for example, we get the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, the good Black person versus the bad Black person, rather than saying, this whole framework is really messed up. Why do we have to rank ourselves in each other in this way? And so then what happens is, in terms of the nation state and that system, is that only those within the human category are allowed to be in the club of sovereignty. And so I have this grid there to show that they're the ones that are allowed to cut the world and own it. And so what happens then is that with Israel-Palestine, since the peace process, Palestinians have thought that they're going to be equal sovereign side by side with Israel. And so they keep insisting, where's the border? Where's the border of our new state? And Israel refuses to have that conversation in a genuine way. And I argue that the border already exists for Israel, and the border is the line between the human and the non-human, and that Palestinians aren't within that club of recognition where they could be possible sovereigns with Israel side by side. And drawing from anti-colonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon, we see people who say, like him, the whole problem is this entire framework, is the way that we relate to each other in terms of these measures of value over who is valuable and who is not. And so then this is why I look at maps. I love looking at maps from people from below. And this is like on Google Earth, this is the article, Joseph, that you assigned, where I looked at how refugees, they map in ways that end up causing a lot more powerful discourses to continue being alive about the creation of Israel itself through Google Earth. And I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. There's also an appropriation of the map, even if it's a colonial map. This is a photo of a map in a refugee camp that has all of historical Palestine there, not just Gaza and the West Bank. This was taken in 2010, 2011. And then also maps of, and I'll finish with this one. This is a map of a camp. I worked with a refugee camp when I was living in Palestine. And this is a refugee camp that is right up against this apartheid wall. And it has like these black dots are sniper towers. And I was asked by the camp residents to map it. We had a lot of conversations about the dangers of that, but we settled on strategically it could be really important. So here I was able to smuggle a high density aerial shot, which only Israel is allowed to take, but then sells them on the market. And I was able to acquire it, smuggle it and give it to the camp. And then from there, I was able to then create a map. Here's a view of that wall that I was talking about from the rooftops of the camp. And this is from when you're in the camp, this is what you see. And over yonder beyond this, the olive orchard, this like Jerusalem is this way. And this is near Bethlehem where the camp is. And Palestinians are just no longer allowed to go to Jerusalem anymore. This wall is in the way. But anyway, getting back to then the mapping, and where I think that I learned from Palestinians themselves that the map itself is not the problem. The map can be a tool. And so here is, I started to map the camp, and just as an example of different ways of mapping that don't need a professional cartographer, because what I found in so much of my work is that this professionalization of struggle is a massive problem. And in particular, like since with the Palestinian movement entering the peace process, what happened is with the struggle itself is that it went from being a very popular struggle where women, children, elderly, everybody was able to participate, where now it becomes the project of the professionals, the cartographers, the political advisors, those people in the negotiations that are going to decide the future for Palestinians rather than Palestinians themselves on the ground, everyone deciding it. So what I like to talk about is like, well, here are, from my point of view as a professional cartographer, this is how I would map Ida Camp streets. I don't know Ida Camp very intimately, and so I'm not even sure if these streets are all that correct. So I ask a resident from the camp, hey, Nadal, can you check my streets? Do they look okay? He says, yes, but the rooftops are also streets. Whenever we're under curfew, we use the rooftops to jump and to give each other food and information. And so I asked him to draw that map. And this is what he drew, the rooftops as streets, and which I argue is just as an accurate map as the one that I made, and is actually one that is far more intimate and knows space and creates space in ways that a professional cartographer like myself or anyone from the outside would not be able to do. So I'll leave it there so we can have more Q&A, because I think I've gone 40 minutes instead of 30 minutes, and I hope that's okay. But I'm happy to show more slides or talk more or listen more, anything that you like. So let me stop sharing here.
Thank you very much, Hiki. That was wonderful. I heard you speak about your research before in grad school, but never in this particular way that I've seen other things that you haven't mentioned before. So, really, such an eye-opening thing for me, and I'm sure the others too. At this point, I was wondering if there are some questions from the audience, or any kind of stories, or maybe parallel examples of how the Palestine situation mirrors some societies that you know, maybe the Philippines, maybe another example of it. Uh, Maybe I'll begin, Kiki, by asking you this question because I was so fascinated by that map that was drawn by an insider in Camp Ida Camp Streets. And here in the Philippines, for example, and as many of the audience could also provide more articulations, is we have a community pantry. This is a kind of Kropotkin's idea of mutual sharing where people actually bring food, vegetables, fruits, whatever to other people who are in need. And this happened only in the light of the COVID-19 lockdown, as well as the rather strict, and that's a big understatement, strict governance of the current president of this country. So people started giving each other those kinds of things. And I was reminded by those stories you have about rooftop streets as spaces of subversion and spaces of clandestine network of people in order to provide for themselves, where governments cease to um, provide them with what should actually go to them. So maybe I don't know if you can respond to that. Maybe a little bit more elaboration about those rooftops, street. Uh,
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Actually, it was a lot of my outlook and relation with Palestine was precisely trying to highlight uh, these processes, and by that I mean that when I talk about the world of 1492, I talk about the imposition of a world, the imposition of a logic, of a worldview, of a philosophy that for example, it splits. This is something very central to the modern world, is that well, it doesn't know how to respect difference. What it knows how to do very well is rank difference. And we learn this in school when we're ranked as a good student or bad student, A, B, C grades, F grades. Uh, we learn this in terms of racial hierarchies. Just skin color then just becomes ranked rather than just respected as different. It becomes ranked. And so what the world of 1492 has done, especially because of the colonial powers, is impose this way of thinking all over the world in places where other worldviews exist. And some of those worldviews and those worlds, I call them, and many scholars call them, many of those worlds have been extinguished, and this is what happened with the genocide of a lot of native peoples. But there are still many worlds that continue to exist where, for example, and this is very prevalent in Asia, like it is in Africa and the Americas with native peoples, is, for example, the yin and the yang, the idea of balance and the idea of fluidity between two things rather than binarism between of two things. And so there's been this imposition of a world where then power has to be imposed from the top. And then we on the bottom and below, we become convinced that we don't create space, that we don't create the world. And so what I wanted to do with Palestine is get to know it more and highlight for myself so I could learn how it is that a movement can continue existing for so long in resistance, highlight parts of those other worlds that still exist. And the rooftops, the streets, I wanted to counterimpose it with mine because my kind of mapping was a very, a very top-down kind of mapping where I had this institutional backing as a PhD to impose a view on Palestine. what I wanted to help do is commit cartographer suicide, like Amilcar Cabral class suicide, uh, by showing that people there know space very well. They create space all of the time. And the rooftops of streets is a way to highlight these exercises of power, these communal exercises of power, which is like the mutual aid practices that you're talking about, that we saw crop up all over the world with all of the lockdowns. And as another really quick example of worlds that continue to exist, and sadly that this is how many of them die, so olive trees. Israel quite regularly uproots olive trees that have been in Palestinian families for centuries, if not millennia. And when you hear it from the outside, you hear this as a crime, that's the property of Palestinians, and Israel just goes and destroys them. But then when you go on the ground, you hear that Palestinians do not, most Palestinians do not think of olive trees as private property. They think of them as family members. But the thing is, if they're going to try to get support and sympathy from the West doesn't really know what it means to treat a tree like a family member. Like, nature is supposed to be an object for domination by humans. And so in order to get sympathy from the West, a lot of Palestinian activists and scholars will use the discourse of the olive trees are private property, because that's what's sacred to the West, is private property rather than life. And so then a problem happens where many Palestinians start believing that olive trees are private property, and they forget that there are other ways of relating to olive trees. And so then those worlds become extinguished more and more when we adopt the imposition of one world, and think that other worlds that exist are either backward or terrorist worlds, or they just don't even exist anymore. So then we don't have that imagination that the world could be otherwise, where many worlds can fit.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? There's one right here. Let me just read it for you. Contending narratives and memories affect their thought of imagined community, by Benedict Anderson. Do you think Orientalism has influenced greatly maps about Palestine?
Yeah, so the idea of Orientalism, which very famously was put forward by a Palestinian scholar named Edward Said, I think it was very powerful in creating our geographic imaginations, which is something that Derek Gregory, another geographer, recently took up in the early 2000s. In that, the West was created maps that made themselves believe that the world was a certain way, where in the case of Palestine, that the land existed and nobody else existed there, that the native people who existed were really just props, from, like, as if they were like playing out some theatrics from antiquity, and that the land was empty. So you get this discourse of Israel making the desert bloom, and it just makes invisible the people there, because what ends up being important from the perspective of colonizers is strategic territories, resources, and those kinds of things. So yeah, Orientalism has greatly influenced these maps on Palestine, because the idea is that the people there, if they do exist, they really don't know anything. And even that they don't know very much, that they need help from the West to become civilized. And that even happens within the Palestinian leadership itself too, because it didn't have maps for a very long time. Israel had maps. And in fact, in the Oslo peace process, the Palestinian leadership was signing maps that Israel produced. The Palestinian movement didn't have a mapping outfit like it does now. And so it blames itself, like, oh, we were so backward, we didn't have maps. But my argument is, like, why would you don't need maps when you know the landscape, like, and you're not backward because you don't have maps. Maps are a tool for specific that arise when societies need them, and Palestinians didn't need them. They were mapped now, and then they did need them in Oslo, because it was not very wise for them to be signing Israeli maps. Um, but the thing about modern maps is that it becomes a marker over whether you are a modern subject, if you're intelligent, if rather than being understood as just a tool for liberation, the idea becomes that those who can make you legible on a map will decide if you should have some kind of liberation or self-determination.
There's another article that you did, which some of my students here read about how Google Earth itself was almost like returned. The term that was used for the situation is to somehow make it work for them in terms of claiming certain territories. And we have some examples of that here too. So Kiki, you may be aware of the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea problematic that's going on right now, and the OpenStreetMap would usually claim those disputed waters as either China or the Philippines, and then it gets changed every hour even. So there's a semantic war on signs that's going on. But what was interesting was that people keep on changing them depending on who gets to go there. So it's a fantastic display of these kinds of cartographies that somehow, if they cannot fight their war for real, they would do it semantically or through maps. That representation is everything. So anyway, oh, there's another question. Go ahead.
Well, this just on that point, I think that when Google Maps came out and Google Earth, there's been so many of these disputes over borders. Like, is Kashmir part of India or is it Pakistan? And I thought it was so fascinating, and I think it's important to keep highlighting these battles because it makes the map no longer seem ahistorical and normal in our lives. Like, we see that there's all of these power struggles that take place in these borders, in these boundaries, and just naming for place names and keeping that alive, highlighting. And this is what I try to do with that article, is to highlight that, hey, none of this is a given. None of this is inevitable. There's all of these power struggles, and we're a lot more powerful than even we think, even if we're not in those halls of power.
Right. Kiki, there's another question here for you. Did you have a chance to check or map the situation of Palestinians living in refugee camps in other Middle East countries, especially Lebanon, Jordan, others?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I did not have a chance to check or map the situation of Palestinians in refugee camps in other countries, and Lebanon is a very important place. I have great friends that do work in the camps there. I have not had the honor of visiting the camps. I visited Lebanon and I visited Jordan, but I'm very careful in entering a camp, and enter it by permission. Um, and even just the question of maps, I was very hesitant with Ida Camp to even map. They found out I was a geographer and they asked me to map, and I told them no. Like, no, maps have ruined everything. You don't want a map, and they're like, well, we need a map. Israel already has all the maps and we don't. And it ended up being very helpful because the base map that I created was the first one that was created of the camp. And then from there, they were able to fix water issues and now have urban gardens on the rooftop and stuff. But I did not have the honor of going into and getting to know other camps in other parts of other neighboring countries. But yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you.
I was remembering one of your stories before when you entered the border and they know you're American, and then they ask you all sorts of questions, and then you answered, well, I want to study church history, which is kind of like uh, something that they phenomenologically would understand as something they would let you in. But if they realize that more than that, it's probably even a critique of the whole thing, they would not have allowed
Yeah.
you.
I had to get a visa renewed, and I was going to get kicked out of the country. But I ended up getting my visa completely by telling the truth. And it was a truth I never imagined that I would be living, is that I was interested in Napoleon. Like, I didn't care about Napoleon before, but that dude was really important in the history of modern mapping of Palestine. And also when I moved to Palestine, I was like, this, everyone says this is a religious conflict, but it's a political conflict. And I don't care. I don't want to know anything about religion. And then it turned out I had to read the Bible to understand what was going on in these map makers' minds when it came to it. And so I understand now that politics and religion are not separate, uh, are not separate the way in the university, the disciplines, they separate them. There's a lot of things that are intertwined in them. But yeah,
Right.
it was really funny. Like you end up studying things in your entire life you never thought that you were going to study, but they become so fascinating and are part of the creation of the world.
There's another question here from Eileen. I don't know if you recall some of the things you said in your article on when the carob tree is the border. For those of you who are not familiar with it, in your carob tree essay, you did come clean about the professional academic becoming caught in the grip of survivalism, preserve ourselves as a mediating class is how you put it. I'm wondering if you could expand on that given your post challenge to binarisms. Perhaps if you could speak about the mapping, not just about mapping from above and below, but from the from the mediating position. I sense there is some possibility of occupying shifting positions, assuming that the geographer keeps trying to be reflexive and keeps agile in carving out space for the work, like you did with the visa rationale.
Well, thank you so much, Eileen, for that question and for reminding me of that. Yeah, I was there is, yeah, as an academic, uh, a lot of the time we are trained as academics or UN workers or workers of any of these traditionally colonial institutions. And, you know, coming from the United States, it's very academia, very colonial institution in the West. We do, you know, everybody under capitalism, because we've been stripped of land and other possibilities that land allows, we have to now sell our labor in order to make money, in order to buy things that we need to survive, to live, water, food, shelter, all of that, security. And so then when we're doing work, anti-colonial work, and we're in these institutions, especially how I was in the United States, um, our political commitments become entwined with our needing to survive and to have money and to have a job. And so then what ends up happening a lot of the time, and I saw this a lot in Palestine with people from the EU and from US or Canada who come working with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or the United Nations, where they're really just there to end up mitigating rather than accompanying in resistance anti-colonial struggles. They go there to mitigate, to like either like raise awareness or to make the like to reduce harm in some way. And all of that is very, very important. But what ends up happening is unless we actually join like an actual anti-colonial movement, we end up just mostly being rewarded to preserve ourselves as a mediating class or as a mitigating class, either one. And the way that I was not able to reconcile that contradiction in my life in academia in the United States, where I had political commitments, and at the same time, I was a scholar and I was being taught that I'm supposed to be outside, just observing everything and reporting on it in an objective way, as if that's even possible, as if we don't live in the world, we don't exist in the world and are affected by it. And so I was not able, in my case, to resolve that contradiction without leaving the university, and which is what I did. And so now I accompany movements, I'm part of movements, and it's in that space where I'm able to truly understand that the map can be a tool. It can be a tool, but that tool is something that its use needs to be determined by a movement. Is this going to help our bigger liberation strategy, or is it weakening it? Because the map isn't necessarily good and it's not necessarily bad. It depends. It depends on the context, but that decision needs to be made by those in struggle using a very, as part of their strategy, understanding the difference between strategy and tactics. And then in that way, as someone who's trained as a scholar, I'm able then to use those tools that I learned in the university of research, for example, of critical theory. I'm able to use those tools on behalf of struggle in a more effective way than having my livelihood intertwined in it. So the jobs that I have now are removed from academia. Some of them have been just working clerical work, and like after I clock out, then I do the more interesting stuff outside in my life. And my job usually doesn't care. They don't ask and I don't tell. They like the work that I do, and they don't want to know anything about what I think about the world. And I love that, which I never thought I would say, because I had been so thankful with academia that, wow, I get to get paid for doing this political work that I love. And so then, but then it ended up being that I was self-censoring, because the people that I was being made accountable to, my peers, were other academics and not Palestinians, not people in struggle themselves. But when I defended my dissertation, a couple of months later, I went back to Palestine in another refugee camp. I presented my dissertation, and I felt that that was my true defense, because I was presenting my research to the people there that I had been living with, doing this work with. And usually that doesn't happen in academia. You're accountable not to people that you live with or that you're studying struggles about. You're accountable to other people who are so removed from it. So in my case, I was not able to reconcile that contradiction without leaving the university. But I have seen some people who are able to do it effectively, but it's rare, but it is possible.
Wow. Thank you very much. That was, I remember we had this conversation about some radicals in our group. They want to be in the university and use that, and others are really leaving the university so they could do this anti-colonial struggles and many other things. And to me, that is very inspiring, despite being usurped by the neoliberal university that I am in at the moment. Anyway, there was this one comment earlier from that individual who asked you about mapping in Lebanon and Middle East countries. Just want to express my support to your work as someone who served in some of those camps from the Israeli side. I completely support the effort to bridge toward a solution via better understanding of the land and equality based mapping. Wow, that's wonderful too. Thank you, Saar. And then Eileen said, "Thank you very much for your candor, Kiki. This is stuff I am losing sleep over all the time, drawing much energy from your writing. Thanks for the nudge with the essays and this talk, Joseph. Maybe this is our existential juncture as well." Eileen teaches art studies, by the way, in the university, but she's auditing my class this semester on counter mapping. So they're reading some Dennis Wood, the white guy.
Yay, Dennis Wood.
uh, and JB Harley and all that. So it's a wonderful experience for me. Are there any questions at some point? Just to remind everyone, it's 3:30 a.m. where Kiki is in California, but she's game for another question. Ma'am Owen?
Sir Joseph, yes.
Yes, please.
Dr. Quiquivix, thank you so much for your very enlightening presentation. I pretty much relate with your realizations and reflections on how maps and worldviews are intertwined. And so maybe I do just like to take this opportunity to also share my experience as a cartographer and as a mapper, who also started from the academe being a student of geography. And then I had the opportunity at that time as a relatively young at that time master student, because I had this chance to work with land rights advocates and anthropologists who at that time were few of the people or groups of people who would appreciate geography, because at that time our discipline, our course was not that popular, or among other people outside from our group. And so having started in that kind of work, I was part of a group that assisted indigenous groups in different parts of the country in collating and putting together maps and spatial information that was a requirement of the government in relation to claiming land rights for ancestral domains. And so in that process, I be at first it was quite difficult because I was technically trained to look at maps and think of maps as something that requires technical expertise and accuracy, and required a lot of training to be able to be able to map and for your map to be sort of credible. But I also, through my work, working with non-government organizations, from that time on, realized how important it is to also understand local context and practices, and to really go deeper into spatial knowledge of different peoples coming from different perspectives. And so I sort of relate to that role of kind of being a mediator in that process, but then also um, eventually being mature in relation to understanding, that you also have a political agenda when it comes to these kinds of practices, and that in many ways, you kind of also shift really, depending on, I guess, the kind of advocacy that you are engaged in, because that could also change because there are so many purposes and utilities of the map, and so many groups and so many advocacies would be interested in mapping and in creating spatial information, and therefore also parang exploring spatial knowledge of different groups of people coming from with different worldviews and perspectives. So I also realized in that process na we really need to also, as mappers and practitioners in the field, collaborate and also try to reach out to other people involved in other kinds of advocacies to further enrich our experience, because really maps are very powerful tools, and it's part of our practice to always reflect and think about how it would impact um, the lives of other people, especially those who are marginalized. So thank you very much for all of the reflections that you have shared.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much for that. I really hear that in terms of when I think about knowledge production and the definition of maps that I critique. I mean, I critique all maps, and for me, critique is just highlighting what the assumptions are of things. This doesn't mean that I love it or I hate it or anything like that. But this question of knowledge with modernity, with the modern world, scientific knowledge is what has taken center. Like there isn't really a lot of room in the dominant modern world for other types of knowledges. And so when I talk about scientific knowledge and the modern map, is as the map, science is just, if it's scientific, it means that it can be replicated because it's, it has a formula that can be replicated. And that's one way of knowing, but there's so many other ways of knowing and other experiences that are so unique and can never be replicated. And a lot of those are more toward the more spiritual and the arts. For example, I think maybe that's a distinction that we might be useful to make with arts and science, is that art can't really be replicated in the way that science is. But they're still very important and valuable. But when it comes to then mapping, there is a lot of focus on, this accuracy. Is the map accurate? And if it's not, then it's not a map. And that's why I wanted to point out the rooftops as streets. That's something that can't be replicated by anyone else other than Nadal. And even if he were to draw it again, maybe he would draw it differently because his memory would be a bit different about how he jumped from house to house. But it's not any less valid. It's just another way of knowing. And I think moving away from binaries, and this is something that I had to learn, is moving away from binaries because I was raised in a Western context by Western schools. When I was telling the camp folks, no, let's not map. The map is evil. The map has ruined everything. I was there falling into this binary of, it's a colonial tool and therefore it's bad. Well, it's a tool and it was used by colonial powers, but it can also be a tool that can be used by resistance, just like how the shape of the colonial map, which frightened Israel, that it's not just Gaza and the West Bank, that it's all of historical Palestine. And the Google Earth one, where the refugees mapped places they weren't supposed to be mapping anymore after the 90s, and they did. And so something that, yeah, just to sum up, the importance of recognizing other ways of knowing as important. Knowledge production is being key, and I think that that can really help us shift our perspective of how power functions. It doesn't just function from above on down. It's also exercised from below through our everyday practices with each other.
Right. Thank you. Wonderful. My gosh, so many things to look into here too. Oni said something too. In my work now, I think about mapping as weaving spatial stories. I like how she worded it. But hopefully, stories that are emancipating and empowering and exploring diverse ways of knowing. If I may just take this moment, as Oni it teaches digital cartography in our department. And one of the things that was so impressed by her was, I hope only you don't mind me saying this, but she usually uses mapping as a way to free the students from the rigidity of it. Because there was, Kiki, there was this one time where there was this big rally in the university about the charter change, and it was in the university, and she asked her mapping class to go there, and so they could imagine a world based on what they heard to create maps. I mean, that's very
That's
exciting to me. I
amazing.
know, that's wonderful. And I think Oni did that. I haven't even thought of that, but she wonderfully was able to bring her students and think through how maps could be deployed, could be used for purposes other than what it is. There's a scholar here, also a junior faculty in another college, who I'm part of his committee work, and his topic is about the Lumad mapping. Lumad Kiki is the indigenous group here that's being marginalized by the government, and so they are traveling all over the country. They came to our university, and we became the teachers. But he calls it mapa cuento, mapa for map, cuento for
Sorry.
story. Yeah, that's right. And so one of the members of her committee said something in the critique of his work. They said, "Oh, I don't like this at all because this is such a westernized. This is a very Western kind of thing." And later on, when I spoke to that guy who was saying to the student, he said, "I don't think he gets it. I think it's really about unmapping." He said, "I'm doing unmapping using the very Cartesian coordinated georeference maps for my purpose of telling the stories of these marginalized groups." And I said, I think that was really lost to that other professor who just basically reduced map as colonial extensions of colonial power. So something to be we can all learn from in using how maps can be deployed for other purposes. So exciting.
Absolutely. And I had to learn that from Palestinians themselves. And it was so beautiful uh, to be in relation with them in that way as my teachers too, rather than me coming as the one that knows everything, because they're the ones that taught me, no, the map is just a tool. Whereas I was over here, well, the Europeans created it, so it must be evil. And that was, very reactionary way of my thinking when I first started to learn about colonialism. I was very angry, and I fell into that binary thinking, where even Europe itself has a lot of really beautiful history of struggle that we don't hear about. And like the United States, a lot of people all over the world, rightly so, do not ever want to visit the United States. They hate the United States. The United States is an empire. But then when they visit, they see so many contradictions here, so much struggle, so much resistance, that they understand it like, wow, it isn't just one thing. They had fallen into this binary thinking themselves, adopting the categories that the West themselves have created, not just the categories, but the logic of it's either this or it's that.
there's one here who uh, said something. Thank you very much for the insights. I'm doing my thesis on the utilization of cartography in producing poetry through the production of representational spaces based on memories, experiences, and the poetics of lived spaces.
That's amazing. That's beautiful.
I know.
I look
Uh,
forward to seeing some of that.
I know. Uh, So one more thing before I finally end this. I know it's 3:42 a.m. for Kiki, but I just wanted to say one more thing, and you don't have to respond to this, but it's wonderful for you to also speak about the border, that it's not just the artificial juridical border that we're made to understand, but it's about the human and non-human. And that is so powerful, in terms of the treatment, how this European imaginary has created the non-human and therefore became the border that separates the us and the them. I remember when we talked about this before, how Said did mention that in his other book, not the one Orientalism, Culture and Exile, I think, where he said something about it really is a European invention. This whole thing is it's an invention, and people believed in it. So
Yeah, it's an invention, and well, anyone can invent anything, but the problem was that they were able to impose that through violence, the colonial powers, through war, and then through forcing that as part of our education system. And so then we end up thinking, growing up thinking that that's just normal, that that's just natural, that there wasn't power struggles for that. Yeah, so super important, I think, to understand that bit of it, the human and the non-human. That so a lot of this work that I presented today, especially on that diagram, is work that I have built off of for my dissertation. It wasn't part of my dissertation, but it's part of my book, the book that I'm writing now, and the new argument that I'm making. And a lot of it comes from thinkers like Frantz Fanon, who think about race, who think about the colonizer and the colonized, and how the geography is just very different between the two. And what polices the line is the police, the police themselves are the line, that they police the line between the human and the non-human, between the colonized and the colonized, and the border itself, depending on borders themselves on the ground. Like if it's in the case of the United States and Mexico, which is two highly unequal countries, where the United States is supposed to be the space of peace and Mexico is the space of war, which you see dramatically play out in very tragic ways with the drug war, where there's so much consumption of cocaine and other drugs in the United States, but it comes into the United States through massive war in Mexico. And so when people come to the United States from Mexico or from Central America, it's not necessarily because they think the United States is a superior place. It's because it's a safer place. They're trying to flee violence. But then that border itself is a dividing line that is between two supposedly sovereign countries, although with Mexico and the United States, the US has very much colonized Mexico in more economic ways and political ways. And the border ends up serving as that human, non-human split of peace and war. And so this is stuff that I've developed since I published my dissertation, and it'll come out in narrative form
uh,
in my book. Yeah, like
can
how
you
I
tell us
used to
something?
write.
Can you tell
Remember
us
how I
something
used
about
to
your
write,
book?
Joseph?
Yeah.
Yeah. Joseph knows I used to write in a fun way,
Yeah.
in a
Then
very
academia
storytelling
came in.
way, until graduate school, I killed that spirit from me. But I'm going back to it now. So
I'm
I'm
so
writing a
glad.
book. It's called Palestine 1492. And it's about my own personal process of learning about Israel and about Palestine. And it begins from when I was 9 years old. The first line is, I was 9 years old when I learned about the cruelty of Europe. I didn't learn it from my Native American parents or grandparents. I learned about it from Jewish history. And it was me learning about the Diary of Anne Frank through a play, and just being completely traumatized by the Holocaust, uh, and being very grateful that Israel existed as a safe place for Jews following the Holocaust. But then about 10 years later, finding out how Israel was created by the expulsion of Palestinians, and then just having my heart broken all over again. And so then my process of the books that I read, the thinkers that really helped me out, and how Anne Frank, I've understood her as a compañera, as someone that has accompanied me on this question of justice throughout my whole life, even with Palestine, where Israel would like it so that we all have this binary thinking that you can't be in solidarity with the victims of the Holocaust if you're going to be in solidarity with Palestinians. And I refuse that division. So I talk about the process that I went through in learning about internal colonialism with my own family, and about some of the dissertation work that I did. And then I end by problematizing this idea of even just Europe itself being a homogenous thing, because I've learned since then that there are lots of movements in Europe, and Europe itself had to be created by like the expulsion of Jews, the expulsion of the Moors and Muslims. It itself had to extinguish a lot of other worlds that existed in Europe, but many of those worlds continue to exist. And so that's after I finish this Palestine book, I'd like to work on another book called Another Europe, that highlights a lot of these things that I've learned about Europe since then.
Oh, wow. Be sure to let us know about it because it sounds like there's a lot of interest for that, for those narratives that you're talking about. I don't mind saying this to everyone that Kiki really writes extremely well. And so one time we were joking about it in grad school where she was able to get this fantastic fellowship, right? And so she worked with the best, with those big cultural studies guys in her program. And then when she asked me to read her work, the first thing that came to mind was that Kiki, I don't recognize you here. I love the old one. I love the one when you write this thing so beautifully and it flows like water. This one, but
Yeah.
academia.
Thank you for saying that. I'm back, Joseph. I'm back. Actually,
Right.
I've been trying to write this Palestine book for the last 3 years. And I tried, and it's gone through so many drafts, and it was going nowhere. And I did not want to speak in the I, because I wanted to produce a book of theory for a popular audience. And a Palestinian friend of mine pointed out how arrogant that is. And it's very colonial to speak as if you're not part of the world, which is like completely against all of my work that I do. And it just like clicked in my mind. And on April 9th, I'll never forget that day, I wrote my first I sentence. And then I just started to cry, like the tear. It was so beautiful. It was so healing. And then ever since then, it's just been flowing. And then I was like, oh my goodness, I used to write this way. And then graduate school happened to me. but but it's really nice. I hope I can share it with you all when
Yeah.
that one comes out.
Thank you very much. There's a last comment here from Darlene. She was especially moved by the rooftops maps as interesting. The rooftop maps are mental maps of survival and caring. They actually reflect more of the patterns of communication, interaction, and how the sense of community is reinforced. So that struck a chord.
Oh, that's beautiful how Darlene put that.
Thank you. Are there any last minute questions for everyone? Um, just reminding you, it's 3:50 a.m. for Kiki. I have to keep on reminding them that
Okay.
we've done so much one things before. Uh, so, if there are no more questions about this, this is now the point where we present you with um, the I'm waiting. Okay, the certificate of appreciation for you for the valuable insights and expertise shared as a virtual resource speaker for the Talk Palestine Mapping for the Geography Webinar Colloquium Series. Signed today. Of course, it's already May 6 for you too, right? Okay, so
Yes.
signed today, 6th of May 2021 by yours truly and Yanni Lopez, who also here and the audience, our chair of the Department of Geography. So thank you very much. For
This is
members,
so beautiful. Please
yeah,
send this to me over email. Yes.
absolutely, and I'm gonna say
Yay.
the word cloud too that they did that these people here did when the word Palestine is mentioned. Now, just to for the audience, just wanted to let you know that we have two more speakers after Kiki. Hazardscape and risk perception happens on the 14th of this month at 6 p.m. That's a Friday. Dr. Lou Angeli Campo will give a talk to that, and then finally the former chair with the Department of Anthropology gives us a talk on cultural memory for DRR, Dr. Soledad Dalisay. So I hope you'll be there for those other talks. But once again, Kiki, our heartfelt thanks for you for being here to talk, and also at such a time when it's very difficult. But we want to know more about your projects in the future. So
It's
thank
been
you.
such an honor. Thank you all. I hope to, Joseph, if you can keep me abreast of people's work as it comes out, because I'm sure I can learn so much.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and
And
yeah,
I
and I'd
hope,
love to be in touch if, when this book comes out.
yeah, and I hope we can make the thing happen that we used to say, which is to bring you here at some point.
Oh,
Travel
yes.
restrictions are no longer a problem for the many of us. So there's a lot of thanks here for you. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you all